What is up, guys and gals? Today we're going to be talking about this thing here. And this, of course, is your Gaudius Maximus, also known as a butt dyno. And when used properly, this thing is a formidable engine tuning weapon. Are you ready for it? Are you ready for my butt dyno? So how can your butt help you tune your car? Well, it's easy. You get your butt, you put it in the driver's seat, and you give your car a road tune. Now, before somebody gets their flamethrower out and starts flaming me, I'm not saying that butt dynoing is better than a real dyno. But I am saying that road tuning is very important, very useful, and that you should do it regardless of whether you're going to a real dyno or not. I'm also saying that on a street, for a vehicle that's going to spend most of its life on the street, a road tune can be just as good and even better in some cases than tuning on a real dyno. Because a real dyno is just as good as the tuner, the owner of the dyno that's doing the tuning of your car. He doesn't have to be the owner, doesn't matter. Why is that the case? It's the case because a dyno is essentially a business, and every business wants happy customers. So when car enthusiasts take their preciously built project car and blindly hand it over to the dyno, the goal of the dyno guy is to get the most horsepower out of your setup, because everybody is obsessed with horsepower figures nowadays. And when he gets the most out of your setup, you will be a happy customer. You will recommend him to other people. He will have more customers, and you get this piece of paper, and you can brag to everybody how you're making so much horsepower with your car. Now, what's sometimes being taken out of consideration in this particular scenario is that the most horsepower squeezed out of your setup doesn't necessarily have to be the setup that's going to make you the happiest when driving your car on the street. For example, I myself have built this car with the single purpose of making me happy. The goal of this car is to make me feel good when I'm driving it. I'm gonna make you feel real good, baby. And I don't really care whether I lose 3 or 5 horsepower, somewhere up at 7,000 RPM, if the rest of my RPM range is going to be better for it. I want something that's responsive and enjoyable to drive, and on the street you're not driving at insanely high RPM all the time, and 3 and 4 and 5,000 RPM is just as important, and in some cases even more important than your top end. So when you're road tuning, you get to feel your car in real world circumstances, and you eventually, after changing it and improving the tune, you get to a setup that feels good to you. But even if you're going to go to a dyno, a road tune is still super useful, and it can save you a lot of money. Because even if you just get it to the ballpark, you are going to minimize your dyno time, and we all know how dyno time can be really, really expensive. And even if you live somewhere really remote, when there's no access to a dyno, a road tune, is definitely a very useful thing. Of course, if you're building some sort of, time attack monster where every fraction of a horsepower counts, a real dyno with a smart and insightful tuner is going to be an absolute necessity. Okay, so that's the disclaimer out of the way. I hope I managed to convey the goal of today's video to you without you thinking I'm saying something else and flaming me. Next up, let's talk about what we will be working with today. So this is my car. It's a 1987 Toyota MR2, which has Toyota's legendary 4AG engine in it. Now, regardless of what initial D fanboys might try to convince you, no, this engine cannot perform miracles or time travel or any sort of that crap. By today's standard, it's a low output engine, but it's a super fun engine that has a great soundtrack and is a really charming little engine. Now, me being a car enthusiast, I of course have done a bunch of little mods to this engine with the goal of making it even more fun and even more enjoyable to drive, and of course, you know, making it sound even better and performing even better. So let's go over the engine and see what we have. Okay guys, so here she is, my pride and joy. Now if you know the 4AGE engine, you have probably noticed already that things are very different on the intake side, and that's because I have converted this engine to run on motorcycle carburetors. Now before you tell me that carburetors are obsolete and stupid and hard to tune, I'm gonna tell you that motorcycle constant velocity carburetors are actually very straightforward to tune. They have an amazing soundtrack and they offer amazing throttle response. So here's a little sound sample for you. Also, of course, this video is going to be mega useful and mega applicable to you if you also have carburetors on your car. But even if you have fuel injection on your car and if you're a fuel injection normie, this is still going to be super useful for you, because I'll be changing jets, you'll be messing with your fuel map, but we're doing basically the same thing, and we're messing in, you know, with air fuel ratios the same way, and we do not want to run too rich and we do not want to run too lean. It's just that our methodology is different. When it comes to the cylinder head, we have some aftermarket camshafts from Cat Cams. We have two exhaust cams from this Cat Cam set, and here are the camshaft specs. We have some Techno-Toy tuning adjustable camshaft pulleys that are going to help us extract the most out of the setup and help us be able to, you know, alter cam timing. When it comes to the valve springs, we have some stiffer HKS valve springs. Down in the block has been bored 0.5 millimeters. We have new pistons, new piston rings. We have increased the compression by using small port 4AG small port piston rings, and this is a 4AG big port, and our compression should be around 10.5 to 1. The engine has been freshly rebuilt with all new bearings, and everything else is new, oil pump, water pump, and so on. So it should be a good foundation, a healthy engine for tuning. We also have a lighter flywheel, which is from a 4AG 20 valve black top, which helps the engine spin more freely. We also have a bunch of other little things. On the exhaust side, the exhaust manifold is stock because it's okay at this sort of power level. The rest of the exhaust has been changed, and it's 2-inch piping with a chambered Volkswagen muffler, and here's what that sounds like. When it comes to the ignition, we have a standalone ignition ECU called the Notice Pro, which is super easy to use, and it's going to enable us to change our ignition maps, again, to get the most out of this setup. So we'll be going over 3 things today: cam timing, fuel supply, and ignition timing. And we're going to start off with cam timing. Okay, first up, cam timing. Now, if you do not know the basics about cam timing, because cam timing is very complicated, I suggest that you watch this pretty old but still really useful video of mine. There's a link in the description, and there's also a link here in the suggested videos you can find and you can learn about the basics, and then come back here so we can road tune cam timing. Now, when it comes to road tuning cam timing, our approach is going to be the same with cam timing, ignition, and fuel. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to establish a baseline, and then we're going to compare future settings with that baseline. So cam timing baseline is 0 advance, 0 retard on either intake or exhaust if you have 2 cams, or if you have a single cam, basically at the end 0 advance, 0 retard on your cams. Then we're going to take our car and we're going to get it on a nice, straight, long, preferably slightly uphill stretch of road. We're going to obviously start in first gear and quickly shift into second gear, preferably below 2,500 RPM. And then, taking road traffic regulations, safety, being cautious, we're going to floor it all the way to the red line. Now this is going to enable us, this is going to give us a nice long stretch of time to feel how the engine works and performs through the RPM range. This is going to enable us how to feel, to feel where the most torque is, where the engine accelerates the hardest, and how it performs. Here's something basic. When you're doing this, don't sit like this, like a moron in your car, driving to your neighborhood. Bruh, I'm tuning my car. You're not, you're being an imbecile. Sit nice and straight, have good posture in your car. I know this is stupid and basic, but the torque is felt, here in your chest when you floor it, and especially on a torqueless engine like the 4AG, you really want to feel all the torque you can feel. Once you have done several pulls like this on this long straight stretch of road, you're going to memorize this in your butt dyno. No, you're not going to memorize this in your butt dyno memory. You're actually going to take a little piece of paper and write down some basic remarks about what you felt. Where is the power? How does the engine perform? Where do you feel? Where do you think the most torque is? Once you have done that, you're going to take the car on a uphill twisty section of road and drive it there in a spirited manner so you can feel how the engine performs in different throttle openings. Again, when you're done, write some basic remarks on a little piece of paper, because we're going to be changing a lot of settings and you're going to be confused later on and you're going to mix everything up. So once we have done this first baseline pulls, we're going to go back to our garage and we are going to change the cam timing. We're going to be working with the cams one at a time if you have two cams. Now we're going to start with the intake and we're going to advance the intake. Now, cam timing is actually difficult to feel. Ignition and fuel, when you mess with them, they're actually easier to feel. The differences are somewhat more noticeable. Cam timing can be really slight and hard to feel. I myself, for example, I'll be honest with you, 1 degree differences of cam timing are impossible to feel. 2 degrees as well. 3 degrees, I can kind of feel it, I'm not sure, but 5 degrees, you can feel that properly. And that's what we're going to use, this sort of easy to feel. We're going to use it so you can see in which direction we should adjust the cam timing. So we're going to start with the intake, advanced, 5 degrees. Go out there and do the same sort of drives again. Again, paper, write it down, compare to the previous one. Then come back, retard the camshaft. The intake camshaft, drive again. What has happened to the power? Is it higher up? Is it lower down? What's happened to the torque? Remember all of that. And then once you're done with the intake, leave it at the setting that felt the best to you. Likely, you're going to end up with a couple of degrees advanced, probably leave it at around 4 or 5 degrees advanced, because advancing the intake usually moves the power higher up where most engines want to perform, at higher RPMs. So once you're done with the intake, you're going to do the same thing with the exhaust. Now if you have a single cam, obviously this is done differently. You're adjusting just one cam, but the process, the methodology, the approach is the same. So once you're done with the intake, do the same thing with the exhaust, drive, come back, adjust, make notes. And then when you're finished with the both intake and exhaust cams, leave them at that setting that you felt is the best one. When it comes to my particular cam timing settings, for reference purposes, here's my first pull with 0 advanced or retarded on either intake or exhaust. My baseline pull with 0 advance or retard on either intake or exhaust. And here's what the engine felt like. The sweet spot was in the mid RPM range. Between 4,000 and 5,500, the engine felt really good. But the top end wasn't any good. There was a lot of screaming, but the engine was slow through the top RPMs and there wasn't much performance or torque or anything. So I then advanced intake 5 degrees. Now, there was a noticeable difference and a noticeable improvement in the top end, and the middle RPM range stayed still pretty good. Now, to confirm this, to confirm that I was going in the right direction, I then retarded intake 5 degrees and the entire RPM range suffered. So this told me advancing the intake was the right way to go. I then did the same thing with the exhaust. Now the exhaust was, I'll be honest with you, harder to feel. Exhaust advanced was definitely all wrong, I could feel that, but exhaust retarded was just marginally better than exhaust not retarded at all. The differences were, I could notice them, but they weren't as significant as when I was changing the intake cam settings. And I was pretty much done with the cam timing. I believe that I have reached the limits of what I could do with road tuning the cam timing, as I still haven't touched fuel or ignition, and you can always revisit cam timing again when you're done with fuel and ignition, and maybe see if you can squeeze even more from the cam timing. So next, we're proceeding with fuel. So tuning fuel is actually quite a bit more straightforward than tuning cam timing. You basically have a specific air-fuel ratio that you will be aiming at different throttle openings. So for example, with carburetors at wide open throttle, we are going to be aiming for around 11.5 to 12 units of air to 1 unit of fuel basically. And that's where the AEM X series really comes into play and really makes the process a lot simpler. There really is no guesswork involved. I think old school is really cool, but doing plug chops and stopping the car on the side of the road and removing spark plugs and then, you know, using clairvoyance to interpret them, that is really awesome, and it's an art and I respect it, but I'm just not that good. And this thing is just a million times better and easier and more accurate. So what we'll be aiming for is 11.5 to 12 at wide open throttle. At mid throttle we can go to 13, maybe 13.5 or so, because we're aiming for some sort of cruising economy at half throttle, and our idle basically can be again 13 and above, or as low as, you know, as high as you can get it in 13.5 to 14 is I guess okay at idle. Now when it comes to my carbs, here's my initial setup. So we have a stock pilot jet which is 40. I managed to get it to idle above 13, actually 12.5 initially, by having the pilot screws just 1.5 turns out. My jet needle is raised just with one stock factory washer, that is the factory stock setting, and I had initially my 145 mains from my Six Sigma jet kit. So those are my main jets. That was my initial setup. Now with that setup, I could notice that my mid throttle, my half throttle was pretty good, but my wide open throttle wasn't any good, and my air fuel ratios would dip as low as 9.5 to 10 at wide open throttle. So performance at wide open throttle in the top RPM range was kind of weak, and as I said, half throttle was pretty good. Now this doesn't make any sense at all, because anybody doing bike carb conversions usually ends up with 160 main jets, and I had the lower ones and I was still running too rich. But regardless of that, my AFR ratios were telling the truth, and I decided to abide by that. So I switched to the stock CBR 600 main jets, which are 132 on the outer two carbs and 135 on the inner two carbs, and I took the car for a drive, and the difference was staggering. It was a different car at wide open throttle. My air fuel ratios were now between 11.5 to 12 at wide open throttle, and the car performed a lot better and accelerated a lot stronger. I was pretty happy. But to confirm I wasn't going insane, I took the 160 main jets, just to confirm, and installed them and took the car for another drive. And this confirmed that smaller main jets were the way to go, because now my wide open throttle would dip as low as 8 on the air-fuel ratio gauge, and the car would actually slow down. Even a child could feel this. The car would slow down when you would open, the throttle fully. It was just very weird and very uncomfortable to drive. So I went back to the stock CBR 600 main jets, although it doesn't make sense, but I confronted it with driving, and we're going to test it out on the dyno to see that I'm not crazy. But one thing that did work perfectly with the stock main jets was half throttle. It was actually quite lean on the stock main jets, around 14.5, which is kind of unsafe because half throttle can be even more prone to knock in some cases, so I wanted to richen my half throttle. This was easily done. I simply raised the jet needle with one more factory thin little washer, and now the jet needle was higher in its little bore, and my half throttle became instantly a bit richer, and it was now around 13.5, which is ideal for some sort of economy at cruising speeds. So these are my air-fuel ratios, and it was really easy adjusting them. And here you can see a little driving, and you can see exactly how it performs at different throttle openings with the smaller stock main jets. So this was definitely easy thanks to the AMX series. Now, if you have fuel injection, you can aim for leaner AFRs, and also if you have a turbo, then you're going to probably go even richer at wide open throttle, depending on your particular setup. That takes some exploring and some research. This was my little case scenario with the carbs. If you have a bicarb conversion, this is definitely applicable. As I said, if you have fuel injection / turbo / whatever, things will be a bit different. So definitely be safe there and look at your AFR gauge. You do not want to see very lean numbers there, except when you let off the throttle. It's okay to go lean then, but when you're on full throttle, mid throttle, you do not want to see very lean numbers there, because knock can easily happen at way too lean numbers. Knock can also happen in some cases when you're idiotically rich at like 8, so that's no good either. So that's it when it comes to the fuel tuning. Pretty simple. Next up, we're moving to ignition timing. So next up, we're talking about ignition timing maps. Now, if you have never seen an ignition timing map before, they might look kinda intimidating and complicated, but bear with me because they really aren't, and they're easy to build and easy to tune. So your ignition map is going to look something like this. In your top row, basically you're going to have your RPMs, and on the side, in a column, you're going to have your engine load, which is either going to be your throttle position sensor, percentage of how much it is opened, or you're going to have your load provided by your manifold absolute pressure sensor or your MAP sensor. Either of them work okay for tuning your ignition maps. Now, a basic rule of thumb towards building ignition maps is that ignition should be retarded as engine load increases, but ignition should also be advanced as RPMs increase. So this is a basic rule of thumb. Now, if you do not want to build an ignition map from scratch, and if your ECU doesn't come with a base map, you can actually cheat a bit. You can go online and find a base map for your particular engine. I guarantee you're gonna find lots of them, and then you're just gonna copy paste them into your ignition, into your ignition map of your basically your ECU. Now, what you're gonna do next after you have copy pasted it there, you're gonna make it safe, and you're gonna retard ignition across the board by a couple of degrees, let's say 3 to 5 degrees, to be safe. You're gonna build a very conservative map, especially in the wide open throttle row at 100% of engine load. This is where you're gonna build it very conservative, because this is where we're going to start our road tuning from. You do not need to drive this conservative map at all. I haven't driven it, at all. There's no need. Your car is going to perform badly. Now, what you're going to do next is you're going to build ignition, as I said, make it conservative, all the way to, let's say, around 5,000 RPM. And at 5,000 RPM, you're going to make a big switch, and you're going to advance ignition by at least 10 to 15 degrees, all the way from 5,000 RPM to the red line. Now, why are we doing this? We're doing this because once you have made this little map, you're going to take your car out for a drive, and you're going to go onto that same long stretch, preferably uphill stretch of road, and you're going to floor it in second gear all the way from low RPMs. And you're going to wait for that turning point at 5,000 RPM. And trust me, it's going to come, and it's going to feel awesome. You're going to feel like you're driving something super slow, and then the ignition, and then the engine is going to like blast off. It's fun, but other than being fun, it's also really useful, because it's something we can feel and we can monitor. And once you feel this big transition, you're gonna come back and you're gonna advance the ignition some more. And you're actually gonna keep advancing the ignition until you cannot feel an improvement in performance anymore. While you're doing all of that, driving the car, you're gonna watch your air-fuel ratios. You do not want to run too lean, because that could be very risky, because messing with the ignition too much and in the wrong way, you could actually end up in knock territory very quickly. So we want to be safe, and we want to be making incremental ignition advance adjustments. So this is my particular ignition map, the conservative one that I made, and here's that big change, my initial big change in ignition advance in the wide open throttle, in the 100% engine load row. And I kept advancing it, and this is what I ended up with. As you can see, quite a bit of advance right there, but my air-fuel ratios were safe, were spot on, and the engine simply felt best at this sort of ignition advance. I test drove it quite a few times. Now, once you have built your wide open throttle 100% engine load row of your ignition map, you're going to build the rest of the map from that row by using that rule of thumb. Now, to actually fully optimize your ignition map is going to take a lot of driving and a lot of time, but it is a somewhat entertaining process. And here you can see my final map. Now, this is definitely not a final map, because it could use a lot of improvement, especially in my half throttle range and at some other places. As you can see, the idle is pretty retarded, because this is how I got it to idle at relatively good AFRs, to basically have some economy and not pollute too much at my idle. So this is my ignition map. I'm going to keep improving it, but I think it's a really good baseline. And what I want to do now is actually measure all of this on a dyno and see exactly what my road tuning has achieved. Okay guys, so that's pretty much it when it comes to this road tuning video. Now, I hope you found it entertaining. I also hope you found it useful. I think this might be a really nice and useful video for tuning beginners, to give them the confidence, to road tune an engine themselves. I also think it should be a pretty useful video in the sense that it can help you reduce your dyno time and save you some money. As always, if you have any sort of questions, feel free to ask in the comment section, and I'll do my best to answer them. When it comes to the Bikart 4AG, finally in the next video, we're actually taking it on a real dyno, and we're going to measure exactly how much horsepower it's making. I'm really have to say that I'm really curious. I know you guys are as well,
right now the engine feels pretty good. It puts a smile on my face when I drive it, when I floor it. It feels pretty nice. And I'm actually gonna go out on a limb here. I'm gonna risk my reputation, and I'm gonna say that it's gonna make north of 120 horsepower at the flywheel. So whether that happens or not, I don't know, but we will see next time. So in the interest of this video not being 11 hours long, I'm gonna end it here. I'm gonna say, as always, thanks a lot for watching. Don't forget to share, like, comment and subscribe, and I'll be seeing you soon with more fun and entertaining stuff on the D4A channel. It's not actually fun and entertaining, it's fun and useful stuff on the D4A channel. Sorry about that.